My name is Malik, and today I will be your narrator, especially for the Red Beret channel. What you're about to hear is not a political drama, not a headline from the news, but something deeply human. A moment that shook a leader to his core and revealed the cracks that even the strongest carry within. This is the story of a man who faced war, betrayal, and poverty, but was left speechless by a single encounter on a dusty street. It happened on a day that seemed like any other, under the scorching midday sun of Ouagadougou. The streets buzzed with life, vendors shouting, motorcycles zipping past, the scent of grilled maize in the air. President Ibrahim Traoré, dressed in plain clothes and without any official escort, walked slowly down the narrow lane of a marketplace. He had always been that kind of man, a leader who walked among his people, who shook hands without gloves, who listened more than he spoke. He was known to disappear from his official schedule sometimes, visiting the very places where he once lived just to remind himself of where he came from. That day, no cameras followed him, no aides hovered nearby. It was just him, the crowd, and the rhythm of the city. But something unusual happened. As he turned the corner near an old concrete wall covered in sun-bleached posters, he slowed down. His gaze locked onto a figure sitting on the ground, almost melted into the background of poverty and dust. A man, barefoot, wrapped in a torn blanket, with a scraggly beard and hair that hadn't seen a comb in years. His hands trembled slightly. He held a small plastic cup, not for water, not for coffee, but for coins. At first, there was nothing particularly unusual. In a country still healing, still rebuilding, poverty is a familiar sight. But then Traoré stopped. His body froze. His eyes narrowed. There was something about that face, beneath the grime, behind the beard, beyond the brokenness. He tilted his head slightly, as if trying to place a memory. A shadow from the past, maybe. A face once seen in a photo, or maybe... No, it couldn't be. He took a cautious step forward. The man didn't look up. His eyes were dull, staring into the dust. And yet, there was something there. Traoré's heart began to pound. He whispered the man's name, uncertain if it was memory speaking or madness. Suleiman? The man didn't respond. A group of women passed by, glancing briefly at the president but not stopping. The noise of the city faded in Traoré's ears. It was just him and this man. He crouched down slowly. His shoes left clean prints on the dirty pavement. Suleiman, he said again, louder. This time the man blinked. Slowly. He turned his head. Their eyes met, and the world shifted. It was him, older, broken, but him. Traoré felt his throat tighten. He hadn't seen that face in over 20 years, not since he was a teenager, not since the night his brother disappeared without a trace. Back then, Suleiman had been his hero, his protector, his everything. The one who made sure Ibrahim had food, who fought off bullies, who whispered dreams of a better life when their world seemed hopeless. But he vanished. No letters, no goodbye. Just silence. Some said he had gone abroad. Others said he joined the rebels. A few whispered that he died in prison. But Ibrahim never believed any of them. He carried the absence like a wound he learned to hide. And now that ghost was here, sitting on the ground, asking for coins. Ibrahim, the man muttered, his voice hoarse like dry leaves scraping against stone. He knew. Traoré's knees weakened. He had faced enemy fire, political assassins, and international pressure, but nothing prepared him for this, for the sight of his own brother like this. He glanced around. A few people were watching now, a phone lifted in the distance. The president of Burkina Faso kneeling beside a beggar. It would be all over social media in minutes. But Traoré didn't care. This wasn't a president meeting a citizen. This was a boy finding his brother. And yet, the questions screamed in his head. Where had he been? What had happened to him? Why didn't he ever come home? But above all, one question burned hotter than the rest. Why did he choose the street over his own family? Traoré wanted to ask everything. He wanted to shout, to cry, to demand answers. But all he could do was stare. The years carved into his brother's face were deep. There were stories in every wrinkle, pain in every movement. And then Suleiman lowered his head. He didn't want to be seen, not like this. Traoré reached out slowly. His hand touched his brother's shoulder, and in that moment everything else, the power, the presidency, the speeches, the cameras, meant nothing. All that mattered was the truth, and the truth was still buried, untold, waiting. Before we can understand what that moment truly meant, before we can feel the weight of what Ibrahim Traoré saw when he looked into his brother's broken eyes, we need to understand who Traoré really is. Because to grasp the gravity of that encounter, you have to know where he came from and why everything he is today is rooted in a past few would survive. Ibrahim Traoré was not born into power. He was not raised in golden halls or taught diplomacy in private schools. He was born into dust, into a village where the nights were too quiet and the mornings came too early. His childhood wasn't marked by toys or trips, but by scarcity, responsibility, and dreams too big for a boy so small. He grew up in a modest family in Burkina Faso, a nation where resilience is carved into the bones of the people. His father was a quiet man, a teacher with strong beliefs and a weak heart. He died young. His mother, a woman of extraordinary silence and strength, did everything she could to raise her children with dignity. She taught them to stand tall, even when there was nothing to stand on. But it was his older brother, Suleiman, who became Ibrahim's shield from the world. When they had one plate of rice, Suleiman split it in half. When bullies came, it was Suleiman who stepped in. When the world ignored them, Suleiman reminded Ibrahim that he mattered. They were inseparable, two branches from the same tree, until the day Suleiman disappeared. One morning he was gone. No note, no sign, just absence. Ibrahim was crushed, but he did not stop. Instead, he hardened. He promised himself that if the world took away those he loved, he would rise until the world could never do it again. He buried the pain and turned it into purpose. He studied. He worked. He joined the military, not because he loved war, but because it was a path, a structure, something that rewarded discipline over despair. And he was good. Too good to be ignored. In a system where promotions were slow and corruption was fast, Traoré stood out, not by playing the game, but by refusing to. He became a commander, then a symbol. He led with clarity, not cruelty. His men followed him, not because they feared him, but because they believed him. He spoke like them, ate with them, walked with them. He didn't hide behind titles. He embodied what they hoped a leader could be. And when the time came, when his country reached a breaking point, when the people could no longer breathe under the weight of foreign influence, internal betrayal, and broken systems, it was Traoré who stepped forward. Not as a power-hungry rebel, but as a man called by the moment. He led a coup, not for himself, but for something bigger, dignity, autonomy. The chance for Burkina Faso to finally belong to its people. He became the youngest president in Africa almost overnight. Cameras followed his every move. Analysts debated his every word. Some feared him, others worshipped him. But none of them really knew the boy inside the uniform. The boy who once cried into his pillow at night because his brother never came home. The boy who promised his mother he would never forget where he came from. The boy who still remembered the exact sound of Suleiman's laughter when they used to chase goats through the fields before hunger replaced play. As president, he was strong, but it was not arrogance, it was survival. He had seen too much, lost too much. And now, with every speech, every decision, he carried not just the burden of leadership, but the ghosts of the past. To the world, Traoré was a rising fire, a force that could not be bought or bent. But inside, he was still looking over his shoulder, wondering if the people he loved would ever come back. So when he saw that man on the street, when the world froze and his heartbeat began to thunder in his ears, it wasn't just a political figure looking at a homeless stranger. It was a boy looking into a broken mirror. And what he saw, what stared back at him, was everything he thought he had lost, everything he had tried to bury. And now it was alive, sitting in the dirt, shaking, waiting. And suddenly, it didn't matter that he was president. It didn't matter that nations waited for his signature, that foreign diplomats debated his intentions, that his face was on billboards and banners. In that moment, he was just a younger brother who never got to say goodbye. A man who had spent his whole life climbing, only to realize the one person he wanted to see at the top had never even been there. The camera flashes, the speeches, the uniforms, they were all background noise. Because right there, in front of him, was a man whose story had never been told. A story that began long before the revolution, long before the world paid attention. And Traoré was about to learn that no matter how far you rise, no matter how powerful you become, there are wounds that title alone can never heal. He didn't want to believe it. He stood there, motionless, eyes locked onto the man in rags sitting before him. Time slowed, the noise of the street faded, and for a brief moment there was only silence, deep, tense silence. Suleiman, his older brother, the man who once carried him on his shoulders, who wiped away his tears and whispered dreams into his ears during sleepless nights, was now barely recognizable. Years had passed, decades even, but those eyes hadn't changed. Ibrahim could still remember them clearly from when they were boys. They had the same sadness, the same depth, only now that sadness had grown into something much darker. Shame, defeat. Suleiman didn't raise his voice. He didn't cry. He didn't even smile. He simply looked up as if he knew this day would come eventually and had been rehearsing for it in his head every night under the stars. He blinked a few times, his lips dry, his hands trembling. Then he whispered something so faint that Ibrahim had to lean in to hear. "I'm sorry I left." That was it. 4 words. But they hit Ibrahim like a bullet. He felt his breath catch in his throat. His brother's voice had changed, worn out, gravelly, as if life itself had been scraping against his soul for far too long. The man who had once protected him from every harm was now the one who needed protection. Ibrahim crouched down, his knees sinking into the hot dirt of the roadside, ignoring the curious onlookers who had begun to whisper, some holding up phones, others covering their mouths in disbelief. The president of the country kneeling in the street before a beggar. No one understood what they were witnessing, but it didn't matter to him. "What happened to you?" Ibrahim finally asked, his voice cracking under the weight of 2 decades of silence. "Where did you go?" Suleiman looked down, unable to meet his brother's gaze. He stared at his hands, calloused and blackened, as if hoping the answers were written in his skin. For a long moment he didn't speak. Then, with a quiet exhale, he began to tell the story. "I ran," he said. "I ran because I wasn't strong enough. I thought I could make something of myself. I had plans, Ibrahim. I was going to work in the mines, send money home, help Mom, help you. But I got lost. There were people, things I didn't understand. I ended up in Mali, then in Niger. I worked, I begged, I stole. And then one night I tried something, a powder, just once. That was all it took. After that, the days blended together." Ibrahim listened in stunned silence. The man who had once taught him to tie his shoes, who had helped him memorize math tables by candlelight, who had shared stories about becoming a pilot or a teacher, was now a man hollowed out by addiction, broken by shame. Suleiman's eyes filled with tears, but they didn't fall. They just sat there, like he had cried too much already and had nothing left to give. "I didn't want you to see me like this," he continued. "When I saw you on TV, when they said you were leading the country, I was proud, so proud, but also afraid. Afraid you would hate me, that you would forget me. I thought about ending it all many times, but some part of me, some stubborn part, held on, maybe hoping one day you'd walk by the street." Ibrahim clenched his fists. The pain was unbearable. Not anger, never anger, but guilt. Guilt for not looking harder, for letting the years pass without searching. He had buried Suleiman in his heart long ago, built a wall around that pain and called it survival. Now the wall had cracked open, and everything he had hidden behind leadership, discipline, and revolution was bleeding through. "I never hated you," Ibrahim whispered. "I never could. I thought you were dead. I mourned you. Every birthday, every holiday, I looked at your side of the table, and I waited." Suleiman's lip quivered, and finally the tears came, slow and silent, cutting through the dirt on his cheeks, revealing the face underneath. The real face, the brother he had lost. "I wanted to come home," he said, "but I didn't think I deserved one." That line broke Ibrahim. With trembling hands he reached forward and placed his palm gently on Suleiman's shoulder, not like a president, not like a man of power, but like a brother, like the younger sibling who had once followed Suleiman everywhere, who mimicked his walk, who laughed at all his jokes even when they weren't funny. The same boy who had once fallen asleep, curled up against him on the cold nights when they had no blankets. "You always had a home," Ibrahim said softly, "and you always will." By now, people were watching openly. Some were recording, others were crying. No one said a word. The moment was too sacred, too raw. Two brothers, separated by years of pain and silence, reunited not in a palace, not in a press conference, but on the hot ground of a busy street. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't scripted, it was human. Suleiman broke down completely. He covered his face and wept. Ibrahim leaned forward and wrapped his arms around him, pulling him into an embrace that was 2 decades overdue. The crowd around them grew, but no one dared interrupt. A woman nearby began to pray under her breath. A man placed his hand over his heart, and Ibrahim whispered again, "You are not dirt. You are not shame. You are my brother." They stayed like that for several minutes, the president and the beggar, holding on to each other as if time could rewind through touch alone. There would be no speech today, no headline, no political maneuver, just a promise. And it began right here. The moment the embrace ended, the silence broke. A few claps erupted somewhere in the back of the crowd, hesitant at first, then building, not like applause for a speech, but something else, something deeply respectful, as if those watching instinctively understood the sacredness of what they had just witnessed. But Ibrahim wasn't hearing it. His mind was elsewhere, replaying every word, every second of the reunion, and simultaneously planning, processing, breathing through pain and purpose. He stood up slowly, his hand still gripping his brother's shoulder. Suleiman wiped his face, overwhelmed, unable to look up. Ibrahim signaled quietly to one of the nearby drivers, who had remained discreetly parked by the edge of the market. The car approached slowly. No sirens, no chaos, just quiet wheels over hot earth. He gently helped Suleiman to his feet. The man struggled to stand, legs weak, body worn down by years of malnourishment and drugs, but Ibrahim didn't let him fall. He supported him like a child learning to walk again. He opened the back door and gestured for him to enter, then followed him in. The vehicle pulled away, and the crowd slowly dispersed, many still staring, whispering, unsure what exactly had happened, but they knew it was important. Inside the car, neither spoke at first. Suleiman stared out the window, blinking like someone waking up from a long coma. Ibrahim observed him quietly, his mind racing. Not as a head of state, not as a tactician, but as a brother. He thought about what would happen next. The media would find out. Whispers would grow into headlines. There would be pressure, questions, distractions. But none of that mattered right now. He had found his brother, and nothing would come before that. They arrived at a discreet side entrance to the presidential residence. No photographers, no aides, just two brothers stepping into a place neither could have imagined sharing again. Ibrahim led him to a guest suite, modest, quiet, with soft bedding and a view of the courtyard garden. Suleiman looked around like a man from another century, lost in luxury he neither recognized nor trusted. He didn't sit. He stood near the window, rubbing his hands together nervously. "I don't belong here," he said quietly. "You belong wherever I do," Ibrahim replied. Suleiman shook his head. "You're president. You have a nation to care for. I'm just a—" "You're my brother," Ibrahim interrupted, gently but firmly. "That's more important to me than any position or title." There was no camera capturing that moment, but if there had been, the look on Suleiman's face might have said more than any speech Ibrahim had ever delivered. It was disbelief mixed with shame, gratitude, fear, and something else. Hope, a fragile, flickering thing that hadn't lived in him for years. Ibrahim left the room briefly and returned with a tray of food, simple dishes, the kind they used to eat as children. He set it down without a word. Suleiman stared at it. His hands trembled again. "I haven't had warm rice I don't even remember," he whispered. "Then eat," Ibrahim said. "You're home." That night, Ibrahim didn't attend his scheduled meetings. He cancelled every appointment, postponed every briefing. Instead, he sat across the table from his brother, watching him eat, listening to the clinking of the spoon against the bowl, and remembering a time when their world was small, when survival meant a full plate and nothing more. When Suleiman finished, he leaned back, tears in his eyes again, and said, "Why are you doing this after all this time?" Ibrahim looked at him and replied, "Because I never stopped waiting for you." The next morning, the staff at the residence noticed something new. A man, thin, quiet, always looking at the ground, was walking slowly in the garden. A few guards asked questions. Ibrahim's response was clear. "He's my guest. Treat him like family." That's all they needed to hear. In the days that followed, Ibrahim arranged for doctors to examine Suleiman privately. The reports were grim, but not hopeless. Years of exposure, addiction, and malnutrition had damaged his system, but recovery was possible, with patience, with love. And Ibrahim had both. He didn't make a public statement. He didn't spin the story. He didn't build a political narrative around it. Instead, he chose silence and action. He personally oversaw Suleiman's detox program, made sure he had company during meals, even read to him some nights, old stories from when they were kids, legends from Burkina Faso, tales of warriors and forgotten kings. It became their ritual, a new rhythm in a relationship that had once been severed by time and tragedy. But there was something else, something deeper. Suleiman, even in his slow recovery, began to smile. It was a weak smile, hesitant, but real. He started to talk more. He asked about their mother, about the village, about old friends. Ibrahim answered everything, sometimes laughing, sometimes choking up. And one night, Suleiman said, "I don't deserve this kindness." Ibrahim paused and responded, "Kindness isn't something you deserve. It's something you give. And you gave it to me first when I was small." when I was scared. You believed in me when no one else did. I've never forgotten that. From that night on, Suleiman changed. He started walking straighter, sleeping longer. He spoke about wanting to help others like him. Ibrahim listened. He didn't rush him. He let it grow naturally. And when Suleiman finally asked if he could speak to recovering addicts at a local clinic, Ibrahim arranged it quietly. That first talk was hard. His voice shook, his hands trembled, but by the end of it, everyone in the room was in tears, including Suleiman. He had found something again. Not power, not fame, but purpose. And as he stood beside his brother afterward, both dressed simply, without titles, just men born from the same earth, Ibrahim whispered, "This is just the beginning." And Suleiman nodded, tears in his eyes, but smiling, for the first time in years. It would be easy to believe that Ibrahim Traoré's story is one of politics, revolution, and leadership. That his name will be remembered because of speeches made or enemies outmaneuvered. But those who were there, who lived beside him, who truly saw him, not just as a president, but as a person, they will tell you a different story. They will speak about the days that followed his reunion with his brother. Quiet days, private days, days that revealed something deeper than strategy or charisma, humanity. Because when a man has climbed so far, when he carries the hopes of millions and still chooses to sit beside a broken sibling, feed him, heal him, and restore his dignity without ever seeking recognition, that is the moment his legacy truly begins. The morale of what happened between Ibrahim and Suleiman was not in the gesture itself, but in what it echoed through the lives of those watching. Ministers and soldiers, journalists and drivers, young students and old men in the markets, they all spoke of it in hushed tones, not because it was a secret, but because it was sacred. A man who led with strength chose to lead, just once, with silence. And in that silence, there was more leadership than in 1,000 declarations. Suleiman, slowly but surely, became more than a brother in the background. He became a symbol of what it means to be seen, truly seen, even when the world has discarded you. In the weeks following the reunion, Ibrahim made an unannounced visit to a public school. He stood before a classroom of teenagers and told them a story, not about war or government, but about loss, about the brother who once carried his books to school, who made him believe that a poor village boy could one day do something meaningful. He didn't say Suleiman's name. He didn't have to. The students listened in silence, eyes wide, and when he finished, one girl raised her hand and asked, "Did you forgive him?" Ibrahim smiled gently. "I never blamed him," he said. That was the essence of it all. He hadn't saved his brother out of pity or duty or image. He had done it because love is not a transaction. It's not a favor that waits to be returned. It is something given freely, especially when the world has stopped giving. The real turning point in the story came not when Suleiman stood in front of recovering addicts to speak, not even when he declared he wanted to serve the country in his own way, but when he said, without hesitation, "I'm proud to be your brother again." That simple phrase carried years of pain, healing, and redemption. And Ibrahim, who had carried the weight of a nation on his shoulders, finally let go of the quiet grief he had buried for so long. In that moment, he was not a leader. He was simply a man who had found something that war and politics could never provide: closure, and perhaps more importantly, restoration. Inspired by that journey, Ibrahim quietly launched a nationwide program, not named after himself, not branded with fanfare. It was called The Second Step, a discreet initiative offering rehabilitation, housing, and vocational training for homeless citizens and former addicts. It didn't make headlines. It wasn't designed to boost approval ratings. But in the corners of cities, in the forgotten parts of villages, lives began to change. One of the first participants was a former soldier who had lost everything to alcohol. Another was a widowed mother who had spent years on the streets with her 2 children. And yet another was a young man who had once tried to end his life because no one would look him in the eye. When asked why they joined the program, they all gave similar answers. Because someone like me was given a second chance, so maybe I can have one too. Suleiman, now living quietly in a modest home just outside the capital, became a silent mentor in the background. He didn't want attention. He didn't need applause. Every Sunday he would visit a community center and just sit, listen, offer a word, a glance. Sometimes that was enough. Ibrahim, meanwhile, continued his work as a leader. But those around him noticed a shift. He smiled more. He paused longer when speaking. And when asked in private what had changed, he would say, "I learned that the hardest war to fight is the one against your own shame, and the greatest victory is helping someone win that war." That victory echoed far beyond politics. It reached homes where brothers hadn't spoken in years. It encouraged people to make that call they had put off, to forgive, to return, to sit across the table and say the words they thought were too late. It reminded the people of Burkina Faso and anyone watching from afar that strength is not the absence of pain, but the choice to love in the midst of it. And for Ibrahim Traoré, that choice came not from power or training, but from a promise made long ago to a boy with tired eyes and a protective spirit. The same boy who had disappeared and then returned when the world least expected it. The story of Suleiman was no longer one of shame. It became one of hope, a reminder that even the most broken chapters can be rewritten, not erased, not forgotten, but transformed. And that, in the end, was the true revolution. Not one fought with weapons, but with arms open. Not one that toppled a government, but one that restored a soul. And in doing so, it restored a piece of the man who had long been seen as untouchable, invincible, unshakable. He had been shaken, but he had stood again, not alone, never alone. The months passed quietly. Life resumed its steady rhythm. The nation pulsed with both struggle and hope, and the headlines moved on to other matters: international visits, policy reforms, economic shifts. But something subtle had changed beneath the surface, something no newspaper could capture, no commentator could fully articulate. It was the way Ibrahim Traoré now looked at people in the crowd, the way he paused longer during speeches, the way he responded, not just as a leader, but as someone who had seen his own reflection in the places no one wants to look. Something within him had settled, not weakened, never weakened, but deepened, grounded. Suleiman remained out of sight from the cameras. He never asked to speak publicly, never sought to tell his side of the story to the world. That was never who he was, not before and certainly not now. He was content with the life Ibrahim had helped him build. A quiet house on the outskirts of the capital, a small garden he tended with great care, and a part-time volunteer role at a shelter where no one knew his last name. He was just Suleiman, a man who came from pain and walked back into purpose. One evening, as the sky turned gold and the calls to prayer echoed softly over the rooftops of Ouagadougou, Ibrahim visited his brother's home without guards, without protocol. He carried with him an old wooden box, scratched and weathered, something from their childhood. Inside it were letters their mother had written but never sent, memories, photographs, drawings from long ago. They sat together on the porch and opened the box piece by piece, memory by memory. Some made them laugh. Others brought a long silence between them, filled only by the rustle of wind and the scent of dust rising from the earth. Suleiman took out a photo, one of the few that had survived all those years. It showed the two of them, barefoot and grinning, standing knee-deep in muddy water after a storm, holding a broken plastic football between them like a trophy. He held it for a long time before speaking. "You know, I used to think that once you were lost, you couldn't come back." Ibrahim didn't reply right away. He looked out at the horizon where the sun was melting into the trees and said, "Sometimes you don't come back the same, but maybe that's the point." Suleiman nodded. They didn't need to say more. The silence between them now was not uncomfortable. It was rich, full of all the things they no longer needed to explain. Later that night, as Ibrahim prepared to return to the residence, Suleiman walked him to the gate. Before he left, Ibrahim turned to him and asked, "Do you regret anything?" Suleiman looked at the stars, then back at his brother. "I regret waiting so long to believe I could be forgiven." The answer lingered in the air, soft and true, and so Ibrahim left, but with a heart that felt lighter than it had in years. He returned not just to a palace or a seat of power, but to a deeper understanding of what that power truly meant. It wasn't the authority to give orders, it was the ability to lift people, to restore them, to choose mercy where others chose condemnation, to carry those who had fallen not because it was expected, but because it was right. In the weeks that followed, there was a noticeable shift in the tone of his governance. He pushed for policies not just for development, but for dignity. He visited prisons and halfway homes. He implemented mental health programs in rural areas. And when asked why, he simply said, "Because everyone is carrying something." But perhaps the most surprising change came in the way the people began to see themselves. They no longer saw the presidency as a far-off institution. They saw it as human, as something that could weep, forgive, and protect. Ibrahim had unintentionally redefined leadership, not through grand declarations, but through quiet, consistent acts of compassion. He never used Suleiman's name in speeches. He never spoke about the moment in the street, but the people remembered. They always would. And deep inside, where no eyes could see, Ibrahim carried something new. Not a burden, but a promise. To never again let silence grow between him and those he loved. To never assume it's too late to come home. And to remind others that no matter how far one falls, the path back is never closed. Only hidden, waiting to be found. One evening, as he stood before a group of young leaders in training, he told them, "The world will measure you by your victories, but your soul will measure you by how you treat the defeated. Learn the difference." The students nodded, but something in the way he said it made it clear. This wasn't theory, it was lived experience. And so, this chapter of his life closed, not with fanfare but with quiet dignity. And like all great stories, it left something behind. A thread that connects to the next chapter, the next soul, the next lesson. Because the story of Ibrahim and Suleiman is not just a story about two brothers, it is about all of us, about what we lose, about who we become, and about the incredible power of being seen even after we've stopped seeing ourselves. And somewhere out there, under the same African sky, another brother, another sister, another lost soul may be waiting for someone to say, "You can still come home." And when that happens, may this story remind them, redemption is real. And sometimes the hand you need the most is closer than you think.